It started with a faint scratching sound. Congressman Daniel Morgan had just returned home from a long day on the campaign trail, his voice hoarse from rally speeches and handshakes. The house stood in quiet anticipation, its facade bathed in the dim glow of the porch light. As he slid the key into the lock, he paused. The noise was faint, but persistent, like fingernails on stone. He glanced over his shoulder. Nothing but the darkened street stretching into the night. Morgan shook his head and pushed the door open, locking it behind him. Inside, the house was unusually still. His footsteps echoed on the polished wood floor as he set his briefcase down by the door. He was used to coming home to an empty house since his wife and son had gone to visit her parents upstate, but tonight felt different. The silence was weighty, almost as if it were waiting for him to notice something he couldn't yet see. He flicked on the kitchen light and froze. On the island counter was an envelope, cream-colored and slightly crinkled at the edges. Morgan frowned. His housekeeper, Marie, had left hours ago, and he hadn't ordered anything or expected mail. The envelope was unmarked, save for the faint outline of something handwritten inside. Curiosity prickling his nerves, Morgan opened the envelope. Inside was a single piece of parchment. The handwriting was sharp and spidery, as though the writer had pressed too hard with the pen. You can't run from what lurks in the shadows. They will vote, too. A shiver ran down Morgan's spine. His first instinct was to dismiss it as a prank. Political opponents played dirty, especially in the final days of a campaign. But something about the words gnawed at him, like a splinter lodged too deep to reach. The scratching noise came again, louder this time. Morgan whipped around, his heart hammering. It was coming from the front door. He approached cautiously, peering through the peephole. No one was there. Swallowing the knot of unease in his throat, he unlatched the door and opened it just enough to look outside. There, etched into the wood just above the doorframe, were 3 deep grooves. They hadn't been there when he came in. The scratches were jagged, each one carved with precision, and they glistened faintly in the porch light as though freshly made. Morgan's pulse quickened. He stepped outside and scanned the driveway and street. There were no cars, no movement, nothing but the low hum of the street lamp. He looked back at the door. The grooves seemed almost deliberate, like marks left by some ritual. A sharp gust of wind bit through his suit jacket, and Morgan retreated inside, slamming the door behind him. The house swallowed the sound, but the feeling of being watched lingered. That night, as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the words on the parchment echoed in his mind. They will vote too. The following day was a blur of meetings and appearances, but Morgan couldn't shake the unease from the night before. He had the scratches inspected by his security team, who dismissed them as likely caused by a stray branch or animal. Still, the image of those jagged lines and the cryptic note gnawed at him. By the time he arrived at his campaign headquarters, his staff was already abuzz with activity. The open plan office, usually a chaotic yet invigorating space, felt oddly subdued. He chalked it up to nerves. Election night was only 2 days away. "Morning, Congressman," his campaign manager Elise greeted him. Her smile was tight, her hands gripping a clipboard with knuckles as white as the paper it held. "Morning," he replied. "What's the update?" "We've had some complications," she said hesitantly. Morgan's stomach sank. Complications. Elise led him into the main office space, where several staffers were hunched over their computers. On every screen, the campaign website displayed an error message. "We were hacked last night," Elise explained, keeping her voice low. "The IT team managed to regain control early this morning, but whoever did this left something behind." She handed him a printed screenshot of the website as it had appeared during the hack. The usual "Vote Morgan" banner had been replaced with a chilling image, a black void, with faint whispers of words swirling within it. A caption at the bottom read, "Your campaign is nothing compared to the shadows." Morgan's hands tightened around the paper. "Did they get any data?" "No," Elise said quickly. "It looks like a scare tactic, but we're running a full investigation just to be sure." The rest of the day was punctuated by minor disruptions. Phone lines crackled with static. Email servers lagged, and some messages disappeared entirely. A stack of campaign flyers was delivered to the office, but the text on them had somehow been replaced by strange symbols, similar to the scratches on Morgan's front door. By evening, Morgan was drained. He returned home, half expecting to find another note or symbol waiting for him, but the house was silent. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to relax. Then, as he poured himself a drink, the power went out. The house plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon outside. Morgan's breath hitched as he reached for his phone, fumbling with the flashlight. Somewhere in the shadows of the house, he heard it again. That scratching. This time it was inside. The scratching sound echoed faintly through the darkness, weaving itself into the silence like a whispered secret. Daniel Morgan froze, gripping the edge of the counter for balance. His phone's flashlight cast a narrow, pale beam, illuminating only the immediate area in front of him. Beyond that, the house stretched into shadowy obscurity. Morgan's breath clouded the air as the temperature seemed to plummet. He moved cautiously, his footsteps hesitant on the creaking floorboards. Every nerve in his body was on edge, his ears straining for any hint of movement. The sound came again, this time from the hallway leading to his study. He aimed the flashlight in that direction, the beam quivering as his hand shook. The hallway was empty, but the oppressive silence wrapped around him, broken only by the soft creak of the house settling. "Hello?" he called, his voice firm but edged with unease. The response was immediate. A faint, almost imperceptible rustling drifted from the study, like the pages of a book being turned. Morgan's heart pounded as he inched closer. His mind raced through logical explanations. Maybe a window was open, letting in the wind. Or perhaps it was an animal, though the scratches on the door suggested something else, something deliberate. He reached the study and hesitated. The door was slightly ajar, a sliver of dim light spilling into the hallway. His phone's flashlight revealed nothing unusual at first glance, just the dark outlines of shelves and furniture. Summoning his courage, Morgan pushed the door open. The room was empty. Or so it seemed. His gaze fell on his desk, where an envelope lay neatly in the center. It hadn't been there earlier. The envelope was identical to the one from the night before, cream-colored, with slightly frayed edges. Morgan's fingers trembled as he picked it up and tore it open. The same spidery handwriting greeted him. "The house knows. The shadows are watching. Stay inside until it's done." Morgan stared at the note, a cold knot tightening in his chest. The message made no sense, yet its implications were inescapable. A faint thud sounded behind him. He spun around, the flashlight beam sweeping across the room, but nothing moved. The air was colder now, heavier, and for a fleeting moment, Morgan could have sworn he saw a shadow shift against the far wall. Not cast by anything, just moving. The power flickered back on. The sudden brightness flooded the room, banishing the shadows to their corners. Morgan's heart raced as he quickly folded the note and shoved it into his pocket. He stepped back into the hallway, closing the study door behind him. For the rest of the night, he slept fitfully, the note's ominous words looping in his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, even in the solitude of his own home. Election night arrived with a palpable tension in the air. Morgan sat in his living room, a glass of water untouched on the table beside him. The television played muted election coverage, the bright graphics and smiling anchors incongruous with the heaviness that hung over him. The messages, the scratches, the strange occurrences, they had all been leading to this night. He couldn't shake the sense that he was part of something far larger than an election, something he didn't understand. The doorbell rang. Morgan's stomach tightened. He hadn't been expecting anyone. Rising slowly, he approached the door and peered through the peephole. The porch was empty, the street beyond eerily still. He hesitated before unlocking the door and opening it just enough to peer outside. Another envelope lay on the welcome mat. Morgan picked it up with a sense of growing dread. This one was different. The edges were frayed as though it had been handled many times, and the handwriting inside was more hurried, almost frantic. "You must leave now. The shadows demand a sacrifice." A sudden, sharp knock at the back door made him jump. The sound was forceful, yet oddly deliberate, like a summons. Morgan's breath quickened as he backed away from the front door. The house seemed to shift around him, the walls pressing closer, the shadows deepening in the corners of his vision. He moved toward the kitchen, his steps hesitant. The back door was visible from the hallway, its glass pane clouded with condensation. Beyond it, the backyard was a black void, the fence and trees obscured by darkness. The knock came again. Morgan stopped a few feet away from the door, staring at the faint outline of something on the other side of the glass. It was indistinct, a silhouette barely visible against the darkness. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice firmer than he felt. No response. The air grew colder, and the faint hum of the television seemed to fade entirely, leaving a suffocating silence. The figure on the other side of the glass tilted its head, its outline distorting as though it were being stretched and pulled. The condensation on the glass began to clear, revealing nothing beyond it. No trees, no fence, no figure. Just an expanse of black. Morgan backed away, his pulse thundering. Suddenly, the television blared to life, the volume inexplicably maxed. Morgan spun around, startled, as the screen displayed not the election results, but a distorted image of his own living room. The camera angle was impossible, as though it were filmed from above. The room was empty except for the faint shadows that seemed to writhe and shift unnaturally. And then the screen cut to static. The knock came again, louder this time. Morgan's resolve broke. He grabbed his coat and bolted for the front door, only to find it locked, though he hadn't engaged the deadbolt. Frantically, he fumbled with the lock, but it wouldn't budge. Behind him, the shadows stretched, curling toward him like fingers. Somewhere deep within the house, the faint scratching sound began again. The air was thick, pressing against Daniel Morgan's chest as though the house itself was alive, breathing and closing in on him. Every instinct screamed at him to leave, but the locks wouldn't budge, and the shadows seemed to thrum with life, curling at the edges of his vision. The scratching sound was closer now, no longer faint or distant. It was deliberate, as if whatever was behind it wanted to ensure he heard every jagged motion. Morgan backed into the center of the living room, the television flickering erratically behind him. The distorted reflection of his own face on the dark screen appeared warped, stretched into an unrecognizable sneer. "Who's there?" he called, his voice breaking. The silence that followed was worse than any answer. A sudden chill swept through the room, so cold that frost began to form on the edges of the windows and the metal fixtures. The glass of water on the table cracked audibly, a thin fracture slicing through its surface. Then came the voice. Soft, rasping, and layered, as if a dozen people were speaking in unison from different corners of the room. "You should have stayed away." Morgan spun around, his breath fogging the air. The shadows were no longer just shadows. They moved with purpose, coiling and stretching across the walls like serpents. The scratching sound resumed, but now it came from all directions, circling him. The symbols. His mind flashed back to the jagged marks on the doorframe. They weren't random scratches. They were warnings, boundaries that had been breached. "What do you want?" Morgan demanded, his voice trembling. The voice came again, softer this time, but more insistent, as though it were whispering directly into his ear. "It is not about what we want. It is about what you owe." The air shifted, the temperature dropping further. Morgan felt a pressure against his chest, as if invisible hands were pushing him toward the hallway. He stumbled, catching himself on the wall. The note in his pocket seemed to pulse against his leg, warm and insistent. He pulled it out, the spidery handwriting almost glowing in the dim light. "Stay inside until it's done." Morgan clenched the note, his knuckles whitening. He didn't understand what it was, but every fiber of his being told him he had no choice but to obey. As he moved reluctantly toward the study, the house seemed to shift around him. The walls groaned, the floor creaked beneath his feet, and the shadows danced with increasing intensity. When he reached the door, it was already ajar, swinging open on its own with a low, mournful creak. Inside, the air felt different, heavier, charged with an energy that made his skin crawl. The desk lamp flickered erratically, casting sharp, jagged shadows across the walls. And there, in the center of the desk, was another envelope. Morgan approached cautiously, his fingers trembling as he picked it up. This time the parchment was cold to the touch, sending a shiver up his spine. The message inside was simple. Sit. Watch. Decide. Morgan lowered himself into the chair, his movements slow and hesitant. The room fell deathly silent. Before him, the wall began to shimmer, the shadows pulling together into a single, swirling mass. Shapes began to form, vague at first, but soon solidifying into images. He saw himself, his campaign rallies, the cheering crowds, the promises he'd made. Then the images shifted. He saw his wife and son, their faces lit with joy as they decorated a Christmas tree. The scene twisted, morphing into something darker. The house was empty, the tree bare, the family gone. The shadows whispered around him, their voices wrapping around his thoughts. The choice is yours. Morgan's heart raced as the images flickered again. Now he saw the election results scrolling across a screen, victory by a narrow margin. But beneath it, the same shadows writhed, darker and more ominous. "What is this?" Morgan whispered, his voice barely audible. The shadows coalesced into a figure, tall and indistinct, its presence radiating an ancient power. "Every decision has its cost," the figure intoned, its voice a chorus of echoes. The note in Morgan's hand burned hot, the words blurring into nothingness. He understood. If he stayed, if he accepted what the shadows demanded, the election was his. But the price was a piece of himself, of his family, of the life he thought he controlled. If he refused... Morgan closed his eyes, the weight of the decision pressing down on him like the shadows themselves. The air grew heavier, the house groaning around him. The shadows surged, waiting for his answer. When he opened his eyes, the room was empty. The television was dark. The frost had melted, leaving faint water trails on the windows. The scratching sound was gone. Morgan looked at the desk, the envelopes, the notes. They were all missing. Outside, a car honked, and the distant sound of fireworks marked the election results. But inside the house, in the corners where the light didn't reach, the shadows lingered. Watching, waiting. And Morgan knew this was only the beginning.